Ecclesiastes 3, we're going to do our main three sections, as we always do. If you guys have got questions, put your hands up and we'll try our best to answer them. We're going to go for section 1, a time for all things, so verses 1 through 8. Kind of covers everything. This is a list of like poetic things. And I don't know if you guys can notice this, they're kind of opposites each time. It's describing different seasons, different times in our lives. We've all had these different things going on in our lives. As you can go through this, where are you right now? Like, what stage of life are you in right now? Hopefully it's not war, but you might be at war with something. You might be at war of sin in your life, or of chaos in your life, or of uncertainty that's causing you to kind of fight for things. Fight for the right things. Fight for what God's got for you, okay? To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. So we can read that God has a time for everything. And typically if God's got a time for it, that means it's a good thing. How do we know that it's a good thing? How do we know that things from God are good? Anyone got any answer for that?
Because God is good.
Because God is good. And what does the Bible say? All good things come from God. Right? If it's not good, then it's not from God. Quite simple. So, God has a fixed time. God has a good plan. God has this sorted out for us. And actually, it's our kind of stubbornness sometimes and our willingness to try and get away from his plan, to leave. Think about Jonah. Think about people who literally turned and walked away and tried to run away from God's plan instead of doing what God's asking us to do. So, God has a fixed plan. He has a time. It's up to us to kind of press into that and hear what he has. When we're born, when we die, when we say our first word, it's a surprise to us on earth, but to God he's going, he did it, she did it, this is great. And I think that's a part of kind of what God's got for us. How are we pressing into God to hear that? How are we hearing his plan? How are we hearing what he's got for us? Because that's a really important part. And even in the very first verse, to know that all these things come from God. That everything comes from him, that there's a time and a season and a place. Notice as well, this word season and a time are two different ways to describe different points and places in time. Different time of day, different season in a year, you could say there's different things. People sometimes say, I'm kind of going through a season of change in my life right now. It's a way to describe certain things. People sometimes use it as an excuse of like, I'm just in a season of change so I can kind of treat people how I want just to see how I fit in, It happens. People use these terms in different ways. When people describe it in Christian kind of life, we kind of look at it more in a sense of like the reaping and the sowing. There's a season of sowing the seed, and then there's a season of reaping the fruit. That's kind of what happens in our Christian lives. But we add extra things in there. A season of running away, a season of doubt, a season of questioning, a season of uncertainty, and then a season of crawling back to God on our knees saying, please, help. So that happens quite a lot. It's happened in my life, I know that. So I don't know about yours, but when I read these things, I think, man, that's really relevant to my life and how I've done things. There's a way that we can read these verses through Ecclesiastes as well. Joshua has already prayed. He prays that it wasn't going to be a Debbie Downer of a chapter. You can read Ecclesiastes and just be like, whew, there is zero hope. But I promise you there is hope. I promise you there is light in darkness. There is opportunity for hope here. And it's in these verses that we can see that all things come from God. A time, a season, and a place that's been set by God. Not by us, because if it was from us, then it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be part of God's plan. It'd be going against what he wants us to do. And that's the key part here. When we read Ecclesiastes, we can get swept into the doom and gloom and sadness and, oh no, what's going to happen? But actually, we should look at it and say, where's the hope? When I read through the book of Job, I do the same thing. Oh boy, this is a heavy book of depression and sadness and loss and even more loss. And oh my goodness, how much loss is there? Where's the hope? And you go, there's little glimpses throughout. And if you don't catch those, you can just see life as a really depressing thing. The same with Ecclesiastes. If you look at it and go, this whole book is about worldly living and worldly understanding and worldly focus instead of godly focus, then of course life's going to be doom and gloom and no hope, because you're not looking at the person who brings hope. If we're looking at God, there's a way to see hope in these things. When we're reading Ecclesiastes, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Where is he? Where's the hope? Where's the life in these verses? Okay? Verse 2. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. So, cool thing, we already know that people like to use analogies and pictures that people understand in the Bible, right? Think about Revelation, think about Jesus, all different analogies of farming, of goats, of sheep, of rams, of all these different things. And this is another one where it's like, there's a time to do this and a time to pick up the things that you've planted. That's a really easy thing for people to understand, especially back then, when there'd be a lot of farmers, there'd be a lot of focus on we need to have a good harvest, good food. Why? Have you read the Old Testament? There's a lot of times when there's not enough food, when there's a lot of famine, there's a lot of times when people go without. So focusing on food is a big deal. Knowing the seasons and knowing how to do those things is a key part of being a farmer. There is a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. Have you guys ever started talking to someone about Jesus and you start trying to sow some seeds in there and you just wonder if it's going to take root? And sometimes someone else has sown some bad seeds or bad fruit or bad knowledge of misconceptions of what the Bible says, and you have to kind of pull that stuff out. And you have to replant and resow and see if that hits and see if that works. That's kind of what we're talking about here, if from a Christian perspective. But from a life perspective, we can see that there's time to be born. Great. You don't have control of that, right? And a time to die. Do you have control of that? Not really, right? And that's the thing. There are good things in life, but there's still no escape from the death. There's still no escape from that end that we're all going to find. Again, the hope that we have is if you know Jesus, you don't focus on that. The being born and the dying is all part of God's plan. And then we have the farming analogy. There are times, seasons that farmers stick to. Imagine being a farmer and you plant in the wrong season. You're not going to get the best harvest. You're also going to be looked at as a farmer that doesn't know what he's doing, right? Planting out a season leads to poor fruit, a bad yield for all the effort put in place. But there's also a thing about being planted by God, being grown by God. A couple of places I'd like you to check out: Jeremiah 18, 7-9, Amos 9, 15, and Matthew 15, 13. All different places in the Bible where God has planted or placed his people to do something. Verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. Cool, there's a time to kill. That's aggressive. Solomon isn't telling us that there's a time to go around and commit murder. Okay, he's saying kill. Kill and murder are not the same word. Not the same word. In the Bible, in the Hebrew, they are different words. They have different attachments, which is good. Because if you go back and you say, thou shalt not murder, and you go, okay, I won't murder, then you find this and you go, there's a time to kill, and you go, well, it means the same thing, so now can I kill? Because it's a little bit later on, then no, different words, don't do it, okay? So Solomon is not telling us a specific time to murder, to do that type of thing, but in fact, there's a specific time to kill. The commentaries that I read through, a lot of them focused on the judicial system. Judges, criminals, bad people, right? And it would be those times of being like, there is a season to do those things. Opportunities to judge people and punish them would come around at certain times of the year. So a time to kill, again, is an opportunity for them to bring justice or their own personal court justice. But also think about war, self-defense, but not malice. Anything out of this season that God's given here would fall under the category of murder instead of killing, right? So I think the fact that you're saying there's actually a time to do these things would say that there's actually a set time for the judicial system back then that they would say, hey, it's these months, it's this time of year we're allowed to do this, or it's the right time to do this. Which to me is kind of confusing. What's this supposed to mean? God has an order for certain things. We've talked about this before. We talked about Ecclesiastes 1 of God's order, God's timing, God's place for all these different things. There's a time to kill, a time to heal, to get better. Because we could focus on the time to kill and be there stuck there of like, man, that's pretty aggressive. But the fact that there's healing offered here as well. I don't know about you, but when I first became a Christian, there was a lot of healing that needed to happen in my heart, that needed to happen in my life, of letdowns, of people hurting me, of confusion, of just lack of understanding, a lack of care, a lack of love in my life, whatever. there was a lot of healing that needed to happen. So the fact that God is still saying, through Solomon here, there's a time of healing that you can have. Boy, I'm really thankful for that. A lot of people in our church are hurting people. And you guys might not think that you're hurting in certain ways, but there might be one point in your life where you just go, I don't understand. I don't know why I feel this way. I feel let down, I feel sad, I feel discouraged. There's an opportunity for God to heal you in those areas. I think it's really cool to kind of see that. A time to break down and a time to build up. Breaks us down to build us back up again. And we see that kind of like a builder tearing down a broken down wall and replacing it with something stronger. I think it's in Japan, they have like the vase fixing. They take a broken vase and they vein it with gold, and there's a certain word for it, and it makes it real strong. It's real beautiful and stuff like that. And I like to think like, that's how God's doing it. But it's like that vase is still fragile. Those joints aren't going to last for a long time. It's almost like God's making us brand new, like he says in the Bible, that breaking down so that we can be changed. You break down an old burnt down building and you tear it all down. You don't leave the burnt frames, the broken frames, and all the insides still there, because it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be strong enough. So you take it all down to build it back up again. And even I think that's a great understanding of kind of what God does with us. He breaks down our kind of immaturities, our misunderstandings, our lack of care, lack of understanding, lack of want, and he builds up inside of us like a maturity to desire him, a longing to love him, to search for him, and to want him in our lives. It should happen with every single follower of Jesus Christ. We should have that push in our lives to do those things. And some people kind of push against it too much. Think about your life. Where do you see God? Where do you see those breaking down and building ups in your life? Healing in the Bible as well. We can read that God literally heals in Isaiah 38:5. He spiritually heals in Psalm 147:3, where he heals up the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And I think it's one of those things that we can see healing and we can look at God and say, hey, I've got a broken arm, God heal me. And he can do that. It doesn't mean that he will. On the inside, that's the thing he's looking at. So that healing isn't just an outside wound, it's the inside, the heart. And he's trying to fix that for us as well. That's the big issue with a lot of humans and a lot of us even choosing to follow Jesus. We still have our own personal heart desires to do what we want instead of pursuing him. That big question is just, who are you looking at? What are you pursuing? Are you pursuing it for Jesus or for yourself? Verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Rituals of mourning were a common thing in those days. Think about Job's friends who mourned him for 7 days when he visited in Job 2:11-13. David sang a song of lament or mourning after hearing of Saul and Jonathan's death in 2 Samuel 1. And even think about Paul when he encourages believers to rejoice with those who are rejoicing and to weep with those who are weeping. Romans 12:15. We can see there's a real thing here. We're being called to take this time and actually embrace it. Be amongst those people who are hurting. Be amongst those people who are needing support. And not just sit in that bad place, but encourage them to look to Jesus instead. I think that's a real key part when we do funerals at church here. You don't just doom and gloom it. You're trying to point it to Jesus. People who are in need, people who are hurting, people who are sad, people who are rejoicing. Well, why? Because God is good. And we can say that because we know God. They might not, so they might not say it. How do you talk to them about it? How do you get the focus to God is the big question. A time to dance. I don't like dancing, really. I don't want a time to dance. No? Edison, you want a time to dance? Not really? Yeah, that's it. I'm not a fan of that. But we can read 2 Samuel 16:12-14, when he danced before the Lord with all that he had, and he wore a certain linen cloth. Psalm 30, verse 11, tells us that God turns our mourning into dancing. We're not being called to dance, but we are called to kind of recognize what God's doing in our heart. Instead of it being this sadness and this sorrow, it's the excitement and the joy. Where do you dance? Why do you dance? Typically back in those days, it would be celebrations, it would be parties, it would be weddings. It would be a good thing to be celebrating, and that's why you'd be dancing. So for us now, we look at it and we go everyone dances on a Saturday night at bars and stuff like that. It's a little bit different. Back then, there would be key moments when you'd be dancing, and it would be a celebration for certain reasons. God's saying, hey, don't dwell. Be excited because there is an opportunity for joy here instead of sorrow. So a time to cast away stones. When you're clearing out a garden, when you're just about to mow a garden, what do?
Take the big stones out.
You take all the stuff off the top that you can see, the branches, the stones, anything that will like fire off and break a window, right? Here's what they used to do in the old world. Right? In the old times, they would literally scatter stones in the enemy's farm area to wreck their harvest. They'd walk through and they'd be marching armies through and be like, hey, even if we don't win this battle, even if we take over this place, even if it all goes well or if it goes bad, we're going to make sure these guys can't grow food anymore. So they would scatter stones as they walked to mess with the guys' harvests. Pretty brutal, Kate, right? Yeah. 2 Kings 3:19, you can check that out if you want. But they would do it so it would mess with their farming. So that's what they do when they'd be throwing out stones. A time to gather stones would be mainly to build. The walls out of stone, everything like that. Think biblically in that way, okay? The stones that used to be thrown away and the stones that were kept, right? Back in those days, the Jews were the precious stones that would be kept. The Gentiles and the rest of the world would be cast away. Now that Jesus is here, Jesus came and he changed everything for the Jew and the Gentile and for the rest of the world, right? Us Gentiles, before knowing Jesus, we were those castaway stones. But now we have been picked up by God and said, actually, you're one of my precious stones, and I want you. So it's not just about physical stones, it's about the meaning behind it all as well. We were, as Gentiles, spiritual castaways, thrown away, but we've been made to be part of God's family. Ephesians 3:19, children of Abraham in Matthew 3:9. We're not castaway stones anymore. God has changed that through sending his son Jesus Christ down on the cross and doing what he did means that everyone can be reached and everyone can be part of the family. And it's not just about the Jew, but it's the Jew and the Gentile and to everyone else as well. Stone being cast away, again, hope. You can all know Jesus. We can all know Jesus. Jesus came to save all, including the Gentiles and the rest of the world. Verse 6, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away. So this castaway is different to the stones. It means to part with a close item of like love or enjoyment. We can see that in Proverbs 11:24. Or to part with something that tempts us. Instead of casting away our relationship with God, casting away the thing that tempts us. Think about Mark 9:3, where we're told to cut off the hand if it leads to sin. That type of idea. Think about even chores. Putting our job or our chores or our things that we need to do instead of what we should be doing, getting away of our relationship with God. Think about Martha, Luke 10. Mary and Martha there, she was distracted with serving. And she says, hey, my sister's been sat at your feet the whole time. And he said, yeah, she's received everything, and you've not, because you've been choosing to do this instead. Those chores can be done at a different time. Spend time with God. Verse 7, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to rend, that's ripping, that ripping of clothes, typically in mourning. See Joel 2:13. Throughout Esther, we read a lot about that. They'd rend their clothes and throw what on their heads? Can you remember? And then what clothes would they wear after? Sackcloth, and then throwing ashes in their hair. They'd wear that to show they were in mourning. And so many of these Old Testament books that we've went through so far have a lot of that in there. So that rending is the same thing, ripping of the clothes, that horrible sadness, and that cry of the heart type of stuff, But also, now think about biblical, the rending from the nations from Israel to Judah being rent apart in Solomon's time, but being brought back together, sewn back together, as we can read in Ezekiel 37:22. We get ripped apart, but we get brought back together because of who? God. A time for silence and a time to speak. This call to hold your tongue, be quiet, to have restraint in speech. It's a reoccurring theme throughout wisdom literature. Proverbs 18:67 tells us that a fool's speech brings trouble. Proverbs 21:23 says that those who hold their tongue avoid trouble. Fool speech brings trouble. If you hold your tongue, you avoid trouble, right? There's a time to speak. We must also learn to control our tongue and when we should speak back. Our voices aren't the most important to hear. If we're blocking out God's voice, then there is a problem. Here, verse 8, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. There are several examples in the Old Testament of what God hates. God's hatred of idolatry, Jeremiah 44, 4 and 5. God's hate towards hypocrisy, Amos 5, 21 to 24. And you can see extra things that God hates in that section as well. Proverbs also lists extra things that God hates. He hates injustice, he hates arrogance, he hates deceit. All of those can be found in Proverbs 6, 16 to 19. Luke 14, 26 also tells us about things that God dislikes or detests or hates. This one gets confusing because it talks about us loving God and hating our parents. Those who love God, you must hate your parents. But that's because our standard of love and our understanding of what that means, right? We must truly love God more than anything else. That's what he's saying there. If you put anything else in front, even your parents, hey, follow me. And he says, I'm just going to go and say bye to my family first. And he's like, I'm leaving now. I'm leaving now. It's that. What's that?
I'm pretty sure what he meant by that is like, hate your parents in comparison to loving God.
Yeah. But why?
Because God's important.
Right. And that can be tough to understand, right? Because you go like, your parents, they provide for you, they love you, they care for you, they look after you. And you go, okay, let's go. So why would I hate them? Well, because actually, we should love God with everything that we have. And that's what's tough. That tough balance for people to understand, you know? God's not asking us to have this breaking in our family because of this, but there should be an understanding that in our family, God comes first. Then it's family, then it's everything else. That balance is really tough to maintain. It really is. Section 2, God is in control of all, 9 through 15. Based on all the things that Solomon's just said through 1 through 8, Solomon is now drawing out the kind of implications of that poem in this section, okay? Key theme throughout this whole thing is God is in charge. God is in control of all. That's the whole point of this, okay? If God's not in control, then we are hopeless. Okay, we cannot discern what that time is or when it will come about, but God has planned it, God is in control of it, and God is with us. Okay, that's the most amazing thing. So verse 9, prophet have he, what prophet? Have he that worketh in that wherein he laboureth? What a sad question. The people aiming to achieve any real gain, anything here, will not see what they want, basically. What profit will you actually see through these things? We can see through the first 8 verses that the laborious things, labor sometimes looks like planting, building up, tearing down, gathering stones, harvesting, killing, healing, war, peace. These are all laborious things, right? Things that happen and take time to do. They take effort. But what is the gain if God is not in the center? That's the question here. Like, what does the laborer profit here if he works and he works and he works and he works and he works, but God is not in the center of it? If they're not in God's time, if it's not in God's plan, if it's not in God's will, then what's the point? And that's a sad question to ask. And you go, Jamie, you said this is going to be the hopeful part. We'll get there, okay? We'll get there, I promise. Verse 10, I've seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of the men to be exercised in it. We have been given wisdom. We have been given guidance. We've been given the truth. Now we have to walk in it. That word to exercise in it, to practice it, to keep doing it, right? To keep running the same drills of read your Bible, pray to God, read your Bible, pray to God. Why? Because once you do it and you do it more, it becomes natural. That sport that you've tried out, that sport, that one drill you've done many, many times, you know, you're an expert when you do something 10,000 times. You do that so many times, it just becomes natural to you. That's the exercise that we're talking about here. It's not that yoga pose or anything like that. It's the getting on your knees and praying, crying out to God, because it's natural to do that. And reading your Bible because you know it's the truth, because it's natural to do that. That's the exercise that we should be doing. And people in this world do not do that because they don't know Jesus, they don't know God, they don't know the truth. But this theme of exercising wisdom through God is a reoccurring theme that we've seen throughout the first 3 chapters so far. Ecclesiastes 1:13, Ecclesiastes 2:12, and now in verse 10 of chapter 3, it's a reoccurring thing of exercising the truth that God has given us, the wisdom. Verse 11, he hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also, ye have set the world in their hearts, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. Like one of my favorite verses, I think, like since doing this study for Ecclesiastes, that he makes everything beautiful in his time. That's an amazing thing to think about. The Hebrew word here, yaphe, is often translated as beautiful, right? But it's also can be understood as good or appropriate as well. But either way, it's positive. It's a good thing from God. So it's all done in God's time and not ours. It's all done, made good instead of sinful. It's made appropriate instead of inappropriate. And it's made beautiful instead of defiled by our own hands. There's a change here, and God's done this incredible thing. But it's in that proper season, in that proper timing again. Instead of the rushed, unpracticed hands of us, it's done by the perfect timing of God, the Creator, who put everything into motion. And there's the hope again. It's all on Him, not on us. He has set the world in their hearts. Solomon knew that men desired to explore. They wanted knowledge, they wanted wisdom, they wanted the smartest guy in the room, right? And we still have that knowledge now. Think about all the people who are doing so many studies, all these different things, to learn more constantly, to push the boundaries. God's put something inside of our hearts, and people are trying to fill it with worldly things. And I mentioned it in the very first chapter, and I said, there's a Jesus-shaped hole inside of our hearts that only He can fill. We can keep trying to fill that with worldly things, but it's never going to be good enough. We need Jesus. He's the only thing that can fill that hole. We can turn as much as we want, but our focus should be on Him. And so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. God has given a man a longing for and an awareness for eternity, for what happens next. That's why we have desires to go and look into the mysterious, right? UFOs and Bigfoot and all the different things and what's happening next and where are we going. And that's why there's so many different religions and so many different understandings all across the world, because people are trying to understand more. What happens next? What is next? What is heaven? What is hell? Is it even a place? Is there a lot of fire there or not? What is it? And people spend their lives wasting the time to try and work out that instead of talking to the person who can actually give them the answers. And we have that opportunity. None of this stuff that we learn on earth will keep us alive past our death anyway. I was a mechanical engineer and I know how to build buildings real tall, and I did it and I built the tallest building into the world. There is no heaven because I've reached the tallest part. And you go, great. Well, when you die and you get to that point and you go, well, I know this, I know my knowledge, and you didn't have the right knowledge, I'm sorry. And that's the sad truth. When you look at the whole big scale of things, what you put your time into investing in right now, the Bible should be there. It is good to know math, it's good to know science, it's good to do all your homeschool and your homework and your schoolwork and everything like that. Like, do it well. Be a really good testimony to all those people around you. But do not skip out on knowing God and learning about Him and what He's saying instead. It's amazing how old this book is, how old it is, yet it still relates to everything going on today. No one can teach you that. No one but God. So just, I know I'm hammering that, but it's a real key thing. Do not drop that, okay? Worldly studies are good. Biblical studies are better, okay? Understand God more, right? Augustine, anyone heard about Augustine? No, Augustine, he wrote a thing called Confessions, okay? In his book there, he said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." He wrote a lot of things. But I really like that. I really like that because I think that's true. Actually, when we find God, when we know God, when we have a relationship with God, finally we get that rest. The world is all looking for this answer, but they're not getting to the point of Jesus. They're filling it with other things. It's not going to be good enough. They're never going to stop. Verse 12. "I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life." Shows us the limitation of human knowledge, which is one of the key themes in Ecclesiastes. And God has set a time for everything, and He's put eternity into our hearts, but we cannot know the vastness of that eternity, and we do not know what time things happen. It's all up to God. And also that every man should eat and drink, and enjoy the good of his labor. It is the gift of God. So if we see all things as a gift of God, if we see the work we do, even the paycheck we get, You know, if we see everything that we do as a gift from God, then we will enjoy it a lot more than what we do right now. Remember that cycle that we went through in the very first one? It was like we work, so we buy food. We buy food to keep strength. We get strength to do what? To work, so that we can buy food, so we can keep it. And it just keeps going, and it's that tireless, you know, you just get fed up and you get bored. And that's why people can't stick with jobs. That's why people don't feel passionate about what they're doing, because there's no joy in what they're doing. It's just endless. If you can find joy and find worth in what you're doing and what God has put in you, it's undescribable about how rewarding it is when you find the right thing that God has got for you. You find that place and you can just say, this is it. This is the right place for me. I want you guys to find that, because it's an incredible spot, okay? 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God, right? Do all to the glory of God. Verse 14, I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. Whatever God does, it will be forever. We can't take it and improve on it. We can't take it and tinker with it. We can't take it and change it, because if we did that, then it would not be as good as what God has for it. When God does it, it's perfect. It's done to the best it can be done. Then that can be tough sometimes, because you go, man, there are ways that I would do this differently. Yeah, but it wouldn't work out the right way. Okay? God gives us good, great gifts. Okay? James 1:17 tells us that every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Everything good is from God. Everything. There's hope in all these things if it is from God. Okay? It's appropriate. It's good. It's Verse 15, I'm going to kind of try and fire through the last section here. That which have been is now, and that which is to be have already been, and God requireth that which is past. This is the same kind of phrase as there is nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1:9 and 10 tells us that, saying again, echoing that statement again, what has been will be, what has already been will always be. And it's just that repetition that we're going to see again, okay? Section 3. Under the sun, verses 16 through 22. Okay, verse 16, this phrase, under the sun, again, used throughout the whole book. It describes the entirety of life on earth, everything under the sun, okay? When Solomon looked at this world, without the thought of eternity, he just saw evil and injustice. Think about the state of the world now, as Jesus has been pulled out of schools, out of politics. Christianity isn't a thing that's allowed in certain spaces anymore, and the world has gotten more evil and unjust because of that. It's a lot of a darker place because Jesus is pulled out. Instead of the fair judgment, he saw wickedness. Instead of God judging the righteous, he saw the wicked judging the righteous. And this is what happens when we do not think of what happens next, when we don't think of what happens in eternity, when we don't consider these things. If this life is all that it is, of course people aren't going to act a right way. Of course people aren't going to be fair and kind and loving. Of course people aren't going to have morals and a standard, because why? You don't need to. We're all going to end up in the dirt anyway. If that's your concern, if that's where you end up, why would you live any differently? But this is the difference. If you know the truth, you have a reason to live differently. If you know the truth, you have a reason to hope, to love, to be kind, to stand out and to be different. And then you can be that kind of testimony to other people. Verse 17, I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. Solomon hits the nail right on the head again. You know, God will judge the righteous and he shall judge the wicked. He is the just judge. He'll also judge out of complete and total authority, because he's the one that should be judging. We see this nowadays, you know, you've got cancel culture and people turning against certain people and getting rid of them, just wiping out their careers, their money, their finances, their family, everything gone because they're judging them. That's not a just judgment. That's sinful people judging a sinful person in a sinful way that leads to more sin. God's judgment is just, is perfect. We won't understand that until we get to heaven and we go, oh boy, I've messed up a lot. Thankfully, Jesus is that. Jesus taking all of that means that we shouldn't worry about it, but we should still understand it. That judgment is perfect. that is precise, that it is good, it is appropriate, it is beautiful, because it's from God. Okay? There will be a time for that judgment, there will be a purpose for that judgment, and a place for that judgment. But again, it's nothing to do with us. It's all to do with God. The truth is, if we think about the eternal, what comes next, we must understand that there's no way for us to accept this glorious gift of what happens next unless we know the one giving the gift. If we don't know God, if we don't know Jesus, if we don't have a relationship with him, a personal one, where we've accepted and we've confessed and believed, you don't get to go to heaven. You could be the most scholarly scholar on all things heaven, but not believe in Jesus Christ and still not get to heaven. Because the Bible makes that very clear. God sent his own son down to do all the things he did. And then Jesus said, no one comes to the Father except through me. In verse 18, Solomon changed his view from mankind to animals. And kind of compared mankind to animals in that. The sad truth is those lives are pretty similar if we don't have eternity in our view, in our understanding, right? Looking deeper into the hearts of mankind, Solomon could see that the way they were living were more akin to animals or beasts. That's not the way that we're meant to live. We're not meant to live in this eat, drink, sleep, repeat, eat, drink. That's not what's meant to happen here. We are meant to be created differently, so we should be acting differently. We have a dog. He's called Finn. A lot of you know this. His thought process is ball, food, belly rubs, squirrels. Then repeat. Okay, that's basically it. You know, there's not much more going on there. Okay, chickens. We have chickens, right? Kate will understand this as well. They eat. They scratch a little bit more, then they eat a little bit more, then they clean themselves, then they eat a little bit more, and maybe they'll lay an egg, and then they'll eat a little bit more, right? That's their process, because that's what happens. But we're created differently. We're meant to be different. We are made to be deep thinkers, emotional beings, made in the image of God, not in the image of beast or animal. The way we live should be different. But we do stoop. We stoop low. And we go, this is just the way it's going to be. That everyday grind, that everyday thing. Without the love of God, that's the way that people live. Without the truth, without God, it is a never-ending, lacking life cycle, basically, right? And that's a tough way to live. But with God, we've been called to be different. Verse 19, Solomon the preacher again thinks about animals dying and what happens when an animal dies. You know, when a beast falls and another one befalleth them, as one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man have no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. Think about death. Think about an animal dying. If it's untouched, if it's not eaten by anything else, it decomposes and it returns back to the earth the way it should be, right? Same with a human. Humans die. If they die in the woods, they decompose and they go back to the earth. But God gave us a different way to live, right? We're created different to animals, and it's when people live like that, without hope or without love, it's all in vain. But God breathed life into us. God breathed life into us, gave us His soul, gave us His physical body, gave us the opportunity to think, to comprehend, to act, to live. There is more to life than what the world tells us. God gave us a purpose, an identity, all these things. Do you accept that gift that God's given us of purpose, of identity, of more? Ecclesiastes can be a downer, but there's hope here, you know? Verse 20, we all return to the dust. Right? From dust you came, and from dust you will return. That's what people say. But Genesis 2:7, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. God formed us out of the world He created, out of the dust. He breathed life into our nostrils. That's why we can be different, because He breathed life into our nostrils. And with that, man became a living soul. There is a difference between how God created man and how God created animals. I want you to go and check that out, okay? The detail is different. The care, the love, the way that we've been created shows the intent that God has for us, the difference that God has for us, a different way of living that we should be living, okay? In verse 21, there is hope from Solomon here that there would be a different destiny between people and animals, okay? But this question, who knoweth? Who knows? Who knows? This question is deeper. It's a deeper question on the heart of all of man, all of people, right? Who knows what happens next? I wouldn't recommend reading him, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Rob Bell put this question out of, where is Adolf Hitler? Is he in heaven or is he in hell? And then everyone got in an uproar and they started screaming and throwing stuff. Of course he's in hell, of course he's in... And he stood back up and he said, well, who knows? And he was just stirring the pot. I don't agree with why he said it. But when we think about this, when we think about like a tough question like that, who knows what happens to those people? If they pray the prayer, they say to God, I'm sorry. They confess and believe in Jesus Christ. Who knows but God? Again, it's all down to him and not to us. Our worldly understanding would say, bad person, go to hell. But God's grace and mercy turns around and says, hey, you can be the baddest guy, but if you turn around and say that you love Jesus Christ and you accept him as Lord and Savior, and you confess that he is who he is, and you believe that he was raised from the dead 3 days later, whoa, he can save anyone. He can save sinners just like us. And that's the beauty, but also the confusingness of God's grace and mercy, because actually our worldly view is, bad person, go to hell. God's gracious view is, everyone can be saved. I don't agree with Rob Bell stirring the pot. I don't know where Adolf Hitler is. But the question still remains. The answer is, the goodness of God is the answer. Goodness of God, not the knowledge of man. Okay? That last verse here. Solomon was a deep thinker. We already know this about Ecclesiastes, okay? He ponders, he thinks, he perceives. But all this thinking, all this perceiving was done under the sun. We have this great section in the chapters, where we said verses 9 through 15, where we get to focus on eternity and not just the knowledge of this world. But after this, we see the first section, there's a time, there's eternity, and now we go back to, but now we need to focus on the world again. And it's kind of like you've adjusted your eyes again. You were looking in the right place, and now you're looking back down here again. And you shouldn't be doing that. Nothing is better than for man to accomplish all the goals they set themselves. Nothing is better for man than this. But afterwards, what happens? What's next? What happens after that, you know? What happens to the legacy? What happens to the history? What happens to the accomplishments after you're gone? Okay, Michael Jordan. Hands up if you know Michael Jordan. Ever heard of him? Basketball guy, you know? Who was the GOAT before Michael Jordan was the GOAT? What about Larry Bird? Magic Johnson? One of those two? Yeah. Okay. What about before them? Bill Russell or Will Chamberlain was the other two that were in contention there, okay? What about before them? It's funny, isn't it? Because you hear about, they're the GOAT, they're the GOAT, they're the GOAT, and you think, these guys have put such high standards on their lives to accomplish such high things that when they get to heaven and they get up to the gates and then, God will be like, hey, Michael Jordan, are you? And, he's still alive, so I'm just saying this as an image. And they go, oh, who are you? He's like, I'm the GOAT. Like, oh, well, you're not the first person to say that. There are other people who have been the GOAT. There will be a new GOAT. So does that actually mean that you are the greatest of all time? Or does that mean that you're the greatest right now? Because that's the tough part, right? There's always a better athlete. There's always a better boxer, footballer, wrestler, whatever. There's always a better person who's going to come and break records. And then your accomplishments are what? They're gone. And you've set your whole life to try to be the very best. But someone better comes. It always happens. When we focus on earthly goals, we get earthly rewards. When we focus on eternity, we see what God truly has for us. And that's the key point here, okay? This chapter, if anything, reminds me of the struggle to keep heaven in our minds, of where we are going, not just where we are right now. Okay, 3 final thoughts and then we'll be done. Okay, guys? First one, God's timing is the best timing. It's the best timing. We might not agree with it all the time. We might not think it's the best timing. God, I don't want to deal with this right now. I'm a little stressed. I've got a lot on my plate. But God's timing is the best because it's there for a reason. We might not understand it. We might not want it. But God's timing is the very best. There is a time for everything in our lives. How do you cope with it? How do you deal with those things that are coming up? Turn to Jesus. Talk to Jesus about these things. He wants to be involved in all situations. Not just the good, the bad, the happy, the sad, all of it. He wants all of it. He wants to know you. God's timing is the best timing. Second one, if you thought about the eternal, if you thought about what's happening next. A lot of you guys in the room already know that you guys are committed Christians and stuff, but this is something that needs to happen every day. Don't take your eyes off of what is going to happen in the future. Heaven is your home. This place is just here right now, right? And I think that's the key part about all of this. When we take our eyes off of Jesus and we fix on lower things, our expectations, our standards, our life gets lower as well. We start to act like the beasts, like the animals, not the way that we're meant to. God created us a certain way, breathed life into us, gave us an identity and a purpose. Jesus has given us a mission to go and preach to all people to let them know the goodness of God. You have a purpose, you have an identity. Eternity should be on your mind as well. Okay. 3, keep your eyes fixed. Kind of mentioned this a few times. You could be the very best person in the world. You could be the GOAT, right? But afterwards, what happens? If you take your eyes off of Jesus and it becomes about you, you slip, you fall short, and let the world sneak in. And that's when we get tempted. That's when we get pulled away. That's when we lose touch with Jesus Christ. And our whole point is to keep our eyes fixed firmly on what He's got for us, not what we think is best, but what